All right, welcome to the wood shop tour. So come on in and I'll show you what we've got here. So we'll start with the general 350 table saw. You can see it here. I've got a crosscut sled set up on the saw right now. That hangs on the wall when I'm not using it. I've got a rip fence that goes out to 53 inches, so I can cut a 4x8 sheet in half if I want to. You can also see that I've got a guard which extends down from the ceiling. I don't use the guard when I'm using the crosscut sled, but when I've got the crosscut sled off, then I do use the guard for ripping of sheet goods or anything else where I can. And also the guard has built-in dust collection. So you can see this, there's a pipe coming in here from the dust collector. This tube is hollow. I've got a blast gate here that I can open to turn on and off the dust collection. So I get dust collection from above the blade, and then I've also got dust collection below, as you typically would. I've got a switch down here to turn on and off the dust collector, and this is also a switch to turn off the table saw, so I don't have to look for the stop. I can just kick it with my foot. And then I've got saw blades and a few other things underneath here. I've got an old desk here that I keep some of my finishing supplies. So this is in a metal, a fully enclosed metal drawer, so it is somewhat fireproof if there was ever a problem. And then swinging around here, I've got an 8-inch jointer, and I've put a bird segmented cutter head in this, which is a lot nicer than the typical knife cutter head because I can just change each of those segments individually. They're all carbide, so they last probably about 10 or so times longer than a regular high-speed steel jointer knife. And I've had this jointer for at least 10 years and quite like that. Then I've got a clamp rack down here where I've got an assortment of C clamps and some F clamps there. I've got some other clamps elsewhere, which I'll show you in a bit. And then moving around here, I've got an older Rockwell drill press, which I bought used from Kijiji. I stripped it all down and repainted it. There was a bit of rust on the column, so I've got all that cleaned up. And normally you would have to change the speed by moving the belt on the pulley, but I found with my last drill press that I just never did that. So I decided this time I was going to put a 3-phase motor on the drill press, controlled with this VFD, variable frequency drive. And so when I turn the drill press on, I've got the VFD wired into the knobs here. So when I turn it on, just by turning this knob, I've got complete control of the speed. And with the particular pulley that I have the belt on now, I can go from just over 100 RPM up to about 2000 RPM. And the speed is displayed on the VFD screen up above. Not that it matters, because usually I can tell what speed I want. As well, this particular drill press did not have the crank, the typical crank that you would get to raise or lower the table. And even if it did, I didn't really like that, because with the big table it's awkward to get behind. So what I did, I've got a lock here, what I did is I added a linear drive, linear actuator that I can use with, it's electrically powered, and with a switch on the side, I can just flip the switch, the table will go down. I can take it down quite a bit, and if I flip the switch the other way, the table goes up. So it's quite easy to set the table height as I want it. I've also got dust collection here, and I've got a blast gate down below, so I can get pretty effective dust collection here. So we talked about the table going up and down on the linear actuator. One other thing I like about this particular table, this is one that I built, is most tables have either a rectangular or a square insert that you drill into. And so as that hole gets larger and larger, depending on the drill bit you're using, with a rectangular or square insert, the only thing you can do is take it out and either rotate it or turn it over. I didn't like that. That's what my last drill press had, because I just wasn't taking it out enough, and so I ended up with a bigger hole than I wanted, so I wasn't protecting the underside of the wood. So with this particular drill press, what I used is a circular cutout, and so now I can just spin the insert to get a fresh piece of wood. And you can see this one's fairly well used. I've got all the circles here. So as this gets used up, I can turn it over, but again, it's quite easy to turn if I just need to get a fresh piece. And when both sides are done, then I've got a bunch of discs, and I can just replace the disc and start fresh with that one. So I find this to be a lot more effective than that square or rectangular insert that's typically used. And then if we move over here, I've got a general 130 planer. I picked this up from a guy living on Lake Erie, and I stripped it down as well and repainted it. I had to rebuild some of the gearbox. Fortunately, General Canada was still selling parts for this particular model, so I was able to get the parts for that. I put a Wixie digital gauge on this, so I can get a pretty accurate height for the table. Especially if I want to repeat a thickness, I can get back to that same thickness quite easily. And I've got dust collection connected to this as well, going up to the pipe here. I've got a blast gate here. This has got a fairly big 3 horsepower ball door motor, so a nice US made motor. So this has got tons of power. The planer I was using before this was more of a lunchbox style, which couldn't take off much wood. This one takes off as much as I want. I've also put the Bird Shelix cutter head in this one, the same as my jointer. So this works really well for figured wood, and similar to the jointer, it's easy to, I don't have to worry about sharpening knives. I can just rotate the inserts as they get dull or if they get nicked a bit. Okay, so swinging around here, I've got an Italian-made Laguna 18-inch bandsaw, and I use this for resawing. It's got quite a bit of resaw capacity. I think actually it goes up to about 15 inches of resaw, and not that I've used anything, cut anything quite that thick, but if I was doing some big logs for bowl turning, or even trying to make planks out of those logs, it's nice to know that I've got that much capacity. But it's not unusual to cut, to resaw 6 or 8 inches, so it works quite well that way. I've got a fence here. I've got fairly good dust collection on this, considering it's a bandsaw, which often doesn't have good dust collection. I've got outfeet rollers here that can pivot down if I want, but I typically leave them up, and they're set even with the height of the table. It's also got a brake here, so it stops very quickly if I put the brake on. And then swinging around further here, I've got a router table here with a Veritas fence. I don't believe Lee Valley sells this particular fence anymore, but this is quite a nice fence. I've got dust collection built in. I've set this up with a zero clearance fence right now for a particular project I'm working on, but typically I've got 2 poplar fences that I attach in like this, but in this case I wanted a zero clearance, so I just built this one specially. And I've got a pretty good collection of router bits under here, so I've got non-straight bits, and then this one is all straight bits in here. And I've got a collection of routers. Well, this is part of my collection of routers in this drawer here, and then I've got some storage in the drawer here as well. And this one is running on a 3 1/4 horsepower Porter cable router, and so it's got plenty of power. Okay, so beside the router table, I've got this oscillating spindle sander. So the drum spins, but it also goes up and down. And the idea behind that is, one, you use more of the paper, so you're not just sanding at a particular level on the drum. And the other thing is, as it sands up and down, you're not as likely to see the swirl marks in the piece of wood that you're sanding. So I use this quite a bit. It's got, this particular unit's got, I think, a dozen or so different sized drums with some different inserts. And I do a fair bit of curved work, so I use this quite a bit for any of the inside curves, and that works quite well. And then moving down here, I've got a really old Craftsman radial arm saw. I bought this from some guy when we lived in Oregon. I think he wanted $25 for it. Didn't work, but as it ended up, it was just the thermal cutter on the motor. So I've fixed that. It didn't have a guard, so I built a guard for it. I just use it for rough cutting to length, and if I want anything precise, I do that on the table saw where you saw the crosscut sled. And then I've got a miter saw here, which I also use, but I was hoping I'd use it for more precise work, but I just find the crosscut sled, if I'm cross-cutting, is far better than this particular one. I've even built a zero clearance fence here, but I still don't get as nice a cut as I do on the table saw. You can see I've got cabinets in here where I've got various things stored depending on close to the tool. So underneath the radial arm saw, I've got a small compressor here, and I've got a bigger compressor that I have up in my garage that I use for spraying or anything where I need a lot of air. This one is great though when I'm using nail guns or something that doesn't use much air. This one charges up pretty quickly, and I'm good to go. I've got some compressor hoses here. I've also got this vacuum hose which I can attach to my random orbit sander, to my dust collector, and so I get pretty good dust collection there. And then if we move around here, I've got a General 260 lathe that I bought from someone in Ottawa, and he had taken good care of it. It was an older guy, and he was getting out of woodworking completely, and so he was selling the lathe with everything he had to do with turning. So that included almost all of the chisels, lathe chisels you see back there. He had a number of chucks, which I've taken advantage of, including this jaw chuck here. So we had 4 different chucks, I believe, that were included. And then if we swing around here, I've got a General 490 bandsaw, I should say, and I also got this as part of a trade for a big General, I think it was a 390 bandsaw that I bought and tried to, I restored it somewhat, but it was just far too heavy to bring to the basement. So that's when I ended up with the Laguna bandsaw, but I wanted 2 bandsaws because this one I use for, I've a smaller blade in it. I use it for more curved work or cutting really small pieces. So it's nice to have the 2 bandsaws. And this one is also connected to the dust collector, as you can see. And then if you swing around here, up top here, I've got sharpening for my lathe chisels. So I've got this Baldor grinder. I had guards on it, but I didn't really like, they were homemade guards. I didn't really like the way they were working, so I've got it set up right now without guards. And I've got these fixtures here, as well as the Lee Valley platforms that I use depending on what I'm sharpening. And then this cabinet up above is actually one that came with the lathe, and this has got some of the chucks and the other turning pieces, the face plates, things like that. So I've kept that on this wall. Okay, so this is a home-built downdraft sanding table. You can see I've got a grid of wood here, and inside, on this side here, is a furnace blower that draws air down through the grid. And if you come around to this side, you'll see that I've got a couple of furnace filters in here. So it draws air through the furnace filter and then exhausts the clean air out the side here. So this is quite effective if I'm doing sanding. You can see I've got a little Porter cable speed block sander here. So anything where I can't use my dust collector, I'll try to do it here on the downdraft table. And this does a pretty good job picking up that dust. Move around further, I've got this big General 100 sander. It's a dual side sander. It's on a platform that rotates. And so I've got 2 16-inch discs here, 2 horsepower motor inside, and so I think I've got an 80 grit on here, and I've got a 120 grit on here. And so I use this quite a bit. It does a really nice job. Nice big table, easily tilts. So if I'm doing some turning work and I need to flatten things, I'll use this. But I use it, as I said, quite a bit for various things. Okay, so I've also got, we talked about the downdraft sanding table. I've also got this air filter that I've made. So this has another furnace blower that I put in here, and it's got a simple furnace filter here, and then a felt filter that I built, and there's one on each end, so it draws air in from both ends, and the air comes out the side there. So I can replace these panels, or these filters, fairly easily. I haven't had to wash this felt filter just yet, but it looks like I probably should. So this gets quite a bit of use when I'm doing turning, where I can't really collect the dust as well while I'm turning. And so it's nice to have this running. All right, so we went over the table saw. I've got a nice outfeed table on the table saw, which is just more than 4 feet from the blade. So if I'm cutting an 8-foot section. It doesn't fall off the end of the table. If it does, I've got some roller stands here if it's something longer that I can use. I've got another Kijiji purchase, which is this General International dual drum sander. So it's got a 24-inch capacity, and I use this quite a bit in conjunction with the planer when I'm trying to get wood down to finished thickness, especially if I want something thin. Like I'm doing some work here where I need 1/8 inch, and actually I'm even going thinner than that. So this could get chewed up in the planer. The drum sander does a great job on that. So I found this to be quite handy. I've got a, well actually my only Festool product is the Domino, the 500 model, and I use that quite a bit. It's really handy, even though I've got a mortiser, which I'll show you in just a minute. I've got my toolbox here on top of another toolbox. I've got various hand planes in here. I do a fair bit of hand work, but I keep them all in the cabinet here. So I've got mostly Veritas hand planes. I've got some chisels here and a bunch of measuring and marking tools up here. I've got some hardware on this back wall. I've got, this is a bench that I made quite a few years ago, and I've got wood and hardware to replace it. I just haven't had time to do that. Right now the bench is set up. I'm cutting some wood for a project where I need a specific radius. So I've got this jig that I've made that rotates on this pin, and used with the plunge router I can get the exact radius that I'm looking for. And then beneath the bench I've got these carousels of hardware. So I've got all the screws here from basically number 4 by 1/2 up to number 8, number 10 by 3 inches. I've got some 1/4 bolts as well. So there's a whole combination of hardware in there. And then over here I've got a mortiser, which I bought from a guy, again, off Kijiji. I don't use this very often, but when I do need square holes, this one really does a great job. The thing I liked about this, and which took me a while to find it, is that with the cranks I can move the table and keep the work clamped into the table. I don't have to worry. Most of the mortisers that I saw, you had to move the wood. The table was fixed. So I was looking for a table that would move side to side. It also moves in and out so that I can get it set up just right. Typically you'd only move it side to side as you're mortising. So this has been a nice addition. And then I've just got this little rolling stand with glue on the one side and a little bit of hardware on here. So this one's quite portable. This wall, I've got some sheet goods here, and I'll show you a bit more of my wood storage. But this is where I keep some of the sheets that I've cut up for different projects. I've also got, you saw the crosscut sled here. This one's limited to about, I think, 18 inches. This one I can do 26 inches. So if I'm cutting something big, then I can use this sled. I don't use it very often, but when I do need to cross-cut a big piece, this works out well. And I got a fire extinguisher here, which I've never had to use. I've got another one down here, so I think I'm set up for safety. So we're in a separate room now, and I've got my Cyclone separator here with a bin underneath that collects all the majority of the wood. And the Cyclone is powered by a 2-horsepower collector over here, and I've got a wind pleated filter on top, and you can see in the bag here that almost all of the dust is collected in the bin here because of the separation from the Cyclone, so very little makes it into the bag. I never have to empty that. I do have to clean the filter maybe once a year or so. I didn't have room in the shop for this belt sander. I hardly use it now with the big 16-inch disc sander, but if I do need it, I've got it here, and I can connect it into this port on the dust collector. And then moving over here, I've just got some storage of a few things that I almost never use. I've got some old motors. There's the drill press motor that I talked about, but it's just waiting for to be used in something. I've got some dust collection pipes. And then all along the wall here, actually both of these walls, I've got all of my jigs. So basically any project I do that needs a jig, I'll build it, I'll date it, label it, drill a hole, and then I mount it, or I have it sitting up somewhere on one of these pegs. And if I need to rebuild something, I can just come in and find the jig. And often I do end up rebuilding stuff that I've made. And then on this table here, I've got my my sharpening station with some Shapton stones here, and I've got a DMT plate here, which I use to flatten the stones, and also if I'm taking off a fair bit of metal. I've got a vise here, so if I'm doing a little bit of metal work, I can do it on this table here. And then underneath, I've got a new purchase here that I got off somebody in Vancouver. He mailed it out to me. This is a Lee FMT Pro. So this is also for making mortise and tenons. I haven't even had a chance to use it. I've got the Bosch router set up, or ready to set up in this, but I just haven't. I've got a few other projects on the go. And then I've also got a Lee 24-inch dovetail jig that I bought specifically for a bunch of drawers for some vanities that I was making for the bathroom remodel. And then the final thing here is I've got this fairly low-end Porter cable scroll saw, and I use it for a few things, but not that much. But there was a particular project I was doing where I needed it, so I looked for this particular saw and picked that up. Okay, so now we're in yet another room. This is the furnace room in here. This is where I keep all of my, well, not all, a fair bit of the wood that I use. So I've got a collection here of, this is all hard maple. I've got a bunch of cherry up here. I've got some other cherry sapele, some white oak. So I've got a collection of wood here. So if I'm working on a project, I can come and pick through to find the best board. Then down here I've got a bunch of smaller stuff that I use for turning. Some fairly thick. This is 4-inch, about 3.5-inch thick curly bubinga, which I've used for some pepper mills. I've got quite a collection here, as I said, of wood. I've got some Claro walnut in there. I see some cocobolo, some ash as well, and then I've got this rack that I built to hold offcuts, because I was generating a lot of offcuts and I needed some way to keep it sorted, and so I've used this. I probably need to go through and pick out some of the small pieces and put them in the fireplace, because there's a fair bit here, and you can see that the offcuts have migrated over here. This was some of the wood that was left over when I did those vanities that I mentioned earlier. All right, so this is the last part of the tour. This is some, I mentioned about the workbench that I was going to be replacing. So this is all of the maple, some 8-quarter maple here, and then I've got some 5 and 6-quarter cherry underneath, and I've got some walnut here as well that I got from a guy who had cut down a tree and dried it himself, and I've made a few projects with that. I'm probably about halfway through that walnut. So this is really the overstock. I couldn't put all of this on the lumber rack that I just showed you, just because of the weight, so I decided to put it here. And that concludes the tour of the shop. I hope you enjoyed it.